This isn't a do not draft list, a bust list, or even a target list. Instead, I wanted to explore what two completely different fantasy builds might look like, one focused on high risk, high reward, upside, and the other built around safe, reliable floor players. Some fantasy managers go all in for league winning upside, while others just want to make it to the playoffs and let the chips fall where they may. So the first team is the upside team. Kick things off with Saquon Barkley, obviously coming off an incredible season. We know the offensive line and defense are elite. He signed a 2-year extension this offseason to make him the highest paid running back. And the biggest thing for me with Saquon is he was tackled at the 1-yard line 11 times, and none of those became a touchdown for him. The downside is he's coming off 482 total touches last season, including the postseason. So there's just a ton of risk coming off that workload. Since 2010, running backs with 400 plus touches in a season have averaged just 12.7 games played the following year. Recent examples include Christian McCaffrey, 4 games in 2024, Joe Mixon, 14 games in 2022, and Derrick Henry, 8 games in 2021. And another thing, which one could argue is a pro about Saquon, is just look at the number of long touchdowns he had last year. He had a 41-yarder, 65-yarder, 68-yarder, 70-yarder, 72-yarder. Is that repeatable? Maybe. He's obviously an incredible talent and electric playmaker, but that's quite a few points coming from those specific plays. And if you really want to dig into it, whether or not you believe in the Madden curse, there's always that kind of looming over. But I still have him as my top ranked running back. But for one reason or another, I've always felt a lot better about my Bijan team. So maybe that will change. Next up is Christian McCaffrey. He's a league winner when he's healthy, right? And Debo was getting 40 carries a year. Jordan Mason's gone. Ayuk might start on the pup. Niners have the easiest schedule in 2025. Apparently, I think it was ESPN had an article about it, but it's like the easiest schedule in the last 10 years. And you can see that in their over-under win totals, 10.5. On the flip side is with McCaffrey, we know he either finishes inside the top 3 or is a complete bust. So with him, obviously monitor camp reports from, the beat reporters, insiders, whoever you like to listen to, not the coaches. Monitor his explosiveness, not that he's just like week 1 ready. You remember last year coaches were saying he'd start the season week 1 if it was a playoff game, and then we know what happened. And I think with the 49ers too, the downside is their offensive line is a big question mark this year. Like Trent Williams is 37 years old. They lost starting tackle Jalen Moore to the Chiefs, scarred Aaron Banks to the Packers. And, if Trent Williams misses time, as he's done every year since 2014, they could be left with a pretty tough situation. And they didn't really address this in free agency. And then they went very defense heavy in the draft, and they didn't take an offensive lineman until the 7th round. So again, a lot to love about CMC, but definitely some risk here. And then with Devon Achane, he's an electric playmaker. He's very involved in the passing game. He was 3rd on the team in targets, ahead of Jaden Waddle. He was more involved at the goal line this last season. He had 15 carries inside the 5-yard line versus 5 his rookie season. Now, Mostert is gone, and Mostert wasn't really a thing last year, but his biggest con or downside is his splits with and without Tua. In the 11 games with Tua, he averaged 22.5 PPR points per game. Without Tua, it was 8.6, which is just, it's not startable. And that's the problem. And we know with Achane, he had a concussion last year. He had a knee injury that put him on IR in 2023. And of course, everyone has injury concerns, but given his size, he's a little bit more at risk. And then you've got Tua on the other side, who's played 1 full healthy season in 5 NFL seasons. So there's kind of a little bit more double risk baked in. Of course, there is with any player, but just we've seen the splits, and it's not good. We'll see what the development of Jalen Wright looks like. He is a little bit bigger of a back, so maybe he gets a little bit more involved in the goal line. And then, they draft Ollie Gordon in the 6th round, who's, a much bigger bruising back. So maybe he gets some of that work, but Gordon is just such an unknown. Like in 2023, he led the FBS in rush yards, and he was looking like he was going to be the top running back maybe in this entire class outside of Genty, or even potentially challenging Genty for that if we were looking back, just a year ago. And then he completely fell off this year. So who knows? And then I will say too, something to call out with this build specifically, because this is a 3 wide receiver league, to start your draft with 3 running backs, there's definitely some inherent risk involved in that as well. But of course, if these guys are all healthy, you are going to have the top 3 running backs in the league, no question about it, and 3 guys that could be vying for the number 1 overall fantasy running back spot. Moving over to the next pick, Jackson Smith-Njigba. We know he's an excellent player, right? He's continuing the legacy of Ohio State receivers. We did a off-season video about Ohio State versus LSU versus Alabama, kind of pulled a bunch of years' data and determine who was wide receiver used. So I'll plug that in the comments. And another little fun tidbit, his wide receiver coach at Ohio State, Brian Hartline, a couple years ago was asked to rank his top receivers, and he had it Marv, JSN, Garrett Wilson, Terry McLaurin, and Chris Olave. I would be very curious to get an updated list that includes Jeremiah Smith. That's neither here nor there. And I guess shout out Brian Hartline because he has now been promoted to OC for the national champions. And I was listening to Matt Harmon on, I think it was the Underdog channel, and he was talking about JSN, and he had a 75% success rate against man coverage. And from week 10 on, led all wide receivers with 4.96 yards per route run against man coverage. Now looking at the negatives, he was wide receiver 10 last year. He didn't really take off until DK got hurt week 8 and Lockett was kind of non-existent. So a lot kind of broke right for him. Now his ADP is wide receiver 12. So you're kind of paying a pretty decent price tag. And I think just so much has changed in Seattle. Ryan Grubb, who's no longer there, was definitely that air raid style. And now Kubiak wants to run the ball. We see this with Geno Smith. Like, he was 4th in the league in pass yards, 4th in the league in pass attempts. And then you switch gears to run focus. Then you bring in Sam Darnold. I'm a big Sam Darnold guy. I'm a USC fan. He went to my high school. But we've seen what this Minnesota Vikings system does for quarterbacks. Like, look at Cousins after leaving, or any backup that steps in there and produces. So if Darnold takes a step back or goes back to what he's been the first 6 seasons of his career, this could go south quickly. And I'm sure if that starts to happen, the Dynasty Bros will be itching for Milroe to come in and do some spot starts. But it's not like we would be able to trust him as a passer. And, JSN has definitely been more of a slot player throughout his career. And does Cup push him outside more? It's tough to say. But that being said, too, if Cup were to miss time, his target share could be enormous. Moving down to Terry McLaurin, it was great. We finally got to see him with a good quarterback. We know he's been a very good player. He finished as the wide receiver 6 last year. Cons are, he's had almost identical stats year over year and just took a massive leap in the touchdown department this season with 13. His prior seasons, he finished wide receiver 28, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 25, 21, and 27. And according to PFF, he doubled his expected touchdowns, which is always cause for potential regression concern. And even though it seemed like he was only the only game in town, he was 37th among wide receivers in target share at 21%. And now you add Debo. But all that being said, we know Jaden Daniels is a great quarterback. So I think we should be able to expect somewhere in that 8 to 10 touchdown range. But the biggest kind of thing at this point is he and Washington are not in a good place and is a potential holdout candidate. And if that happens, I would be pushing him down quite a bit. With Mike Evans, you can probably pencil in 1,000 yards. You're going to get the spike weeks. You're going to get some dud games. But, the thing was, looking back at last year, Godwin was the clear leading receiver when they shared the field for the first 6 weeks. He will be 32 years old when the season starts. I'm by no means out on him or fading him big time. Just, it has to be acknowledged. And if Godwin is healthy all season and resumes the role that we saw last year, now they add first-round receiver Emeka Egbuka, shout out to Ohio State again, who is definitely going to command targets and who the coaches won't stop talking about in camp. And they lose Liam Cohen, and clearly they found a nice piece with Jalen McMillan last year as well. So a little bit of risk there, but again, by no means someone I'm out on this year. Now, at the quarterback position with Justin Fields, we know this is all about his rushing upside, and he also loves to run it at the goal line too, which is just kind of icing on the cake. We're going to see so many design runs in this offense. Breece Hall being a legitimate threat for defenses will open up some lanes for Fields as well. And we've seen him finish as high as QB7 in 2022 when he only threw for 2,200 yards. And I will say, looking at last year, he was playing okay. He didn't look comfortable as a passer and was benched, even though that they were 4-2. He had a couple spike weeks, but those were both 2 rush touchdown games. And I will say my thing with Fields is he's never really reached the ceiling that we think he can or want him to. Like I mentioned, he finished as QB7 in 2022, but we see guys that we don't expect to finish in that range end up there all the time. Like look at Sam Darnold last year, finished with more points last year than Fields had from that season. And look at like Baker Mayfield, Bo Nix. Like I know I'm reaching here, but even Sam Howell was technically a QB1 in 2023. And I think we know what Fields is as a passer at this point. In 50 career games, he's thrown only 45 touchdowns to 31 interceptions. That's about the same number of touchdowns that Burrow threw all of last year. And he is a little bit more of an injury concern than most QBs. Like he missed 5 games his rookie season, 3 games in 2022, and 4 games in 2023. And not to mention, there's a good chance the Jets are just bad. Like their over-under is 5.5 wins. If they're trailing and he's forced to throw more, we can see some ugly dud games. I don't think he's necessarily a benching candidate like we saw last year, just because what's the point of putting Tyrod Taylor in on a team that might be jockeying for the number 1 position? And then Jameson Williams, very talented player on an elite offense coming off what really was a breakout season, finishes the wide receiver 19 and only had 58 catches. And the Lions have talked about how they want to throw down the field more and how they want him to be a breakout player, even more of a breakout player than he was last year. But my concern with JMO is 6 of his 7 receiving touchdowns were over 35 yards. 4 of those were over 50 yards. The Lions were the highest scoring offense in the league last year. They lose Ben Johnson and their center. Vegas projects them to score 1 fewer touchdown per game this season, which is, they're still projected to be a top 5 scoring team, but 1 touchdown per game is a lot. And I personally think that guys like JMO and like maybe Monty are going to be a little bit more impacted than guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown. And this was an interesting stat. I saw a tweet today that as much as we think of JMO as this like boom bust type player, which he kind of is in his own right, the highest weekly point total of his career in half PPR is 23.5. And then with JJ McCarthy, we know the system's awesome. We know the weapons is awesome. Like we saw Darnold do it last year. Like they should have one of the best offensive lines in the league. Like I'm in on JJ this year, like within reason, but we still haven't seen it yet. And I think in Superflex specifically, there is a heightened risk of taking rookie quarterbacks just because the position scarcity if they do end up underperforming. And then with Kelsey, his resume obviously needs no introduction. He still caught 97 passes last year, just got a little unlucky in the touchdown department with 3, but still finished as the tight end 7. And Andy Reid said he's not looking to limit his snap count. And the downside is he's 35. He's obviously lost a step. And now you get Rice and Hollywood back with a year 2 worthy. So there's just a ton of mouths to feed. And then with Travis Etienne, we're only a year removed from him finishing as the RB3, right? And we know Liam Cohen orchestrates an amazing run game, an amazing offense. And looking at last year for Tampa Bay, the team rush yards before contact was just elite. They jumped from 27th in the league in 2023 to 7th in the league in that category. And, this is important because Rashad White, who's not an efficient runner, had the highest yards per carry in his career by a lot. Sean Tucker had over 6 yards per attempt. So I will say, I think this system is going to be designed a lot better, but the risk with ETN is he was a big bust last year. Like there's no better way to put it. He was just a major disappointment. We saw Bigsby carve out a role. They bring in Bashal Tutin, who's a speedster, who was the only pick of this regime. He was someone that the GM brought up as a target when he was interviewing for the position, but he's had fumbling issues in college. We saw him like the first day, I think, of OTAs fumble the ball, and that got called out. And I guess the overarching point is we just don't know for sure how this backfield is going to shake out. And then rounding it out with a couple rookie wide receivers, Luther Burden, very talented player. He was handpicked by this new regime. he's a slot player, and everyone talks about Ben Johnson's slot role and who's going to be the Amon-Ra of this offense. And, the DJ Moore marriage with Ben Johnson is off to a bit of a shaky start. So maybe Luther Burton can get a whole bunch of opportunities, but the downside is that there's a real chance that he's the number 4 or even the number 5 target option in this offense, which obviously renders him obsolete. And then with Kyle Williams, 3rd round pick, the film bros definitely love him. He has a real chance to be a go-to option for Drake May. He can easily be the number 2 right out of the gate. The downside is this is about where Jalen Polk was going last year, and we saw how that worked out. Shifting gears to the safe team. Things off with Justin Jefferson. We know he's the best wide receiver in the NFL. You can make a case for Chase, but regardless, he's top 2 for sure. And we saw him be wide receiver 2 last season. He's never finished outside the top 5 in his 5 years, other than when he was hurt in 2023. Last season, he had only 2 single-digit scoring games. I know McCarthy is an unknown, but the system is so good, and they let Darnold walk, that I'm not worried about that at all for Jefferson. And then with St. Brown, he's just a model of consistency. He's had between 106 and 119 receptions the last 3 seasons, double-digit touchdowns, and finished as the wide receiver 3 in back-to-back seasons. He was the wide receiver 8 in 2022 on 6 touchdowns. So the point I'm making is it feels like his floor is still a top 10 wide receiver. And like I mentioned with JMO, like I'm more concerned with Ben Johnson's departure with some of the other role players in this offense versus the connection that I know Amon-Ra and Goff have. And then with AJ Brown, again, another top 5 receiver in the NFL on an elite team. He was wide receiver 12 in points per game last year. He was only a point behind Amon-Ra and Puka in that category, and half a point ahead of Drake London. And the Eagles were last in the league in pass attempts and 3rd to last in pass yards, which was, of course, by design because their run game and defense were so great. But the point here is that just feels like the floor last year. Like, outside of a potential injury, that just makes him so safe. And the potential upside, if they do need to pass more, is through the roof. And then with James Cook, RB8 last year, RB11 the year prior, he went from no carries inside the 5 in 2022 to 5 carries inside the 5 in 2023 to 15 in 2024. So he did run hot on touchdowns, but that was also just a lot of opportunities. And, Josh Allen still had 12 rush touchdowns, which was the 2nd highest mark of his career. And, with Cook, he had 12 fewer receptions last year than the year prior and almost 200 fewer receiving yards. So even if both of these things kind of regress back to the mean, like more receptions, more receiving yards, fewer touchdowns, you're still looking at a fairly safe top 12 running back, in my opinion. I know he's kind of becoming a little bit more of a polarizing prospect, but we've seen him finish where he has the last 2 seasons in 2 very different ways. And he's the clear lead back on an elite offense. So he's someone that I'm continuing to invest in. And then with Kittle, to be able to get Kittle 2 to 3 rounds after Bowers and McBride just feels like one of the safest picks in fantasy football. He was the tight end 1 in points per game last year by a full point. And I think he kind of unfairly gets bucketed into this player that's like always injured or boom bust type of guy. But other than 2020, he's never played less than 14 games in his 8-year career. And every player is going to have some dud games, but his blow-up games can win you that week. And not to mention, he just signed a 4-year extension. Debo's gone. Ayuk might start on the pup. And Mason had a stat about this on the Underdog channel that since 2021, Kittle has played 8 games without Debo and has averaged over 20 points per game, which is just astronomical. And with Goff, QB6, QB7, QB10 in the last 3 seasons. However, he's never drafted that way. And I think we're finally seeing his ECR rise to like QB12. And even at that cost, it feels more than fair. And I think with Goff, the stability he provides is even more valuable in Superflex. So, I have no issues being out on him in 1 QB leagues if you're shooting for some upside when you can get someone to replace that player that's a little bit more high risk on the wire. Like say, for example, you go in on Drake May and he's not playing well, and then you can just grab like Stafford or Tua or even Goff in some cases. But in Superflex, the wire is so thin or non-existent at quarterback, like you want to count on that stability. And then with James Conner, in his 4 seasons in Arizona, he's finished RB10, RB18, RB20, and RB5. They signed him to a 2-year extension, and nothing has really changed in this offense. And yes, I know he has an injury history, but you're getting a top 12 back at minimum when he's on the field. And RB2 value, where he's currently being drafted at, is probably the easiest thing to replace on the waiver wire anyways in Superflex. So, and if you really want to just like lock up this backfield and protect that investment, just take Trey Benson at the end of your draft. And then with Dak, he's a little bit tougher call because the injuries are starting to pile up over the course of his career. But in his last 3 full healthy seasons, he's finished as QB3, QB8, and QB2. And yet you can get him around QB16. And not to mention, they also added George Pickens to this offense, which should open up even more space for CeeDee Lamb, not to mention Pickens' big playability. And if the injury stuff scares you, just grab a third QB like a Geno, who's more of a floor play anyways. And with DeAndre Swift, I know he gets a lot of flack, but his finishes aren't that bad. Like even last year in that bad offense, he was RB19. In his 5 years, he's finished between RB18 and RB23, so you know exactly what you're getting with him. And the Bears didn't really do anything in the draft outside of Kyle Monangai late. Are we still trying to make Roschon Johnson a thing too? And like now in terms of free agency, like Nick Chubb's off the board, J.K. Dobbins is off the board, so it looks like they're just going to roll with Swift. And then with Jacoby Myers, like look at his finishes the last 3 seasons: wide receiver 23, wide receiver 24, wide receiver 28. Yet he's always drafted much, much later and consistently finishes as a top 30 fantasy receiver. And last year, he led the league with 0 drops on 87 receptions. And after the departure of Devontae Adams, he averaged 73 yards per game. And, you know, obviously Bowers is probably going to be the top target earner, but we already saw that last year, and we saw how good Myers was as well. And you know, they add Jack Besh, who's a really nice player and a nice addition to this team, but Besh has never really been a high target earner anyways. And then now he gets a massive upgrade at the quarterback position as well. And then with Shakir, I'm not really in on Shakir, as I see almost no upside, but everyone always wants to talk about finding Josh Allen's leading target earner, and it was very clearly Shakir. Like he had 25 more targets than the next leading pass catcher on this team. But even with all that, he still finished as the wide receiver 38. Like I think Shakir makes more sense in like a deep PPR league as your wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. But if you want a guy that's just going to be out there on a good offense that's going to be earning targets, like Shakir is very safe. And then with Javonte, he should definitely be the lead back on what should be a decent offense. And he didn't look great at all last year, but one of the things the Cowboys are going to ask a lot from him is in pass protection, which means he could be a 3-down workhorse. Like I like Jaden Blue as like a deep sleeper, but he by no means profiles as a workhorse. He was never that guy at Texas, and his skill set is more as like an explosive pass catcher or change of pace guy. Like I'm not saying with Javonte it's going to be pretty, but he should get enough volume to be an okay floor play. And then with Pittman, the dude played last year with a broken back and still commanded 111 targets. In the 3 years prior, he's averaged 142 targets per year. He's never been a big touchdown guy, and this offense got even more crowded with Tyler Warren, but I have no issues taking a guy this late I know can consistently command that number of targets. So that's it. That's the high upside versus high floor teams. Let me know which ones you guys prefer, and look forward to seeing the next one.